Good day, folks. My name is Mike Harold. I am with the Cincinnati Insurance Company. I work in the loss control department and I specialize in transportation and logistics risk management, consulting with our clients, identifying issues or gaps, and working with them to close those gaps to better their position out on the road. My goal here today is to bring to you some tips, some understanding of why we need to do these things, some things to make your business better or your exposure better. They won't all work for you all the time, but hopefully you can get a few of these items in place in your organization to make your day go a little better. I've been in this industry for 40 years, really heavily focused on auto for 30. I come from the greater Cleveland area of Ohio, and I am commonly known by many of my business and personal friends as Highway Harold instead of Mike Harold. So feel free to remember me that way. So let's first set the plate on kind of what's going on in the world today with auto. I'm hoping to get away today with three key goals, three key objectives for you folks. How and when your organization can be exposed to a loss, the impact of not effectively managing this risk on the road, and what you guys can do, what you folks can do to minimize your risk and improve your defense posturing. We'll talk about defense posturing in a little bit. While my whole concept is I'm going to bring to you is really appropriate for any kind of vehicle and any kind of operation, I know that the main concern here in this visit today is the large capacity vehicles. And that's where we're going to focus. But keep in mind, if you have other vehicles, other types of vehicle operations, that all this is very appropriate. So why are vehicles such a problem in the whole world of auto? And let's look at just our highways. We are a tough place to drive on. We lose about 35,000. I'm going to update that a little bit for you. 35,000 people every four every hour. About 257, 260 people are involved in disabling injuries. Motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for folks under the age of 30 and over the age of 1, which is really kind of startling. There is kind of a sad new metric in there that overdoses from opioids is creeping in on the 20 to 30-year-old age group. But yet, think about that. The leading cause of death for folks over 1 year old and under 30 is motor vehicle crashes. And a newer metric we're seeing is we can confidently say that there are at least 8 fatalities a day due to texting. This is probably way low because people don't typically admit to texting when they're behind the wheel. Sometimes it can't be very easy or real easy to prove that texting was an issue in this thing. There are estimates that it's 3 or 4 times that number, but it's growing, and texting and use of handhelds we'll talk about a little bit. It's not going away. So we want to really keep in mind those things when you talk to your drivers and your management team. These numbers, there's a slight delay in the presentation of these numbers. Right now, as of 2019, it was around 36 to 37,000 fatalities a year. That number, the early indications for this past year are in the low 40s, 42,000. One would think that doesn't make sense because there were so many less vehicles on the road in the past year. But what we saw is that we definitely saw a drop in frequency of events. But concurrent with that, we saw an increase in the severity. And if you think about it a little bit, it makes sense. There's less people on the road. If you've been on the road in the last month or two, there's a startling increase in the speed that everybody is driving at. And with that speed comes so much more energy. that can be or will be released in a crash. So there's a lot more severity out there. But those numbers are preliminary, but there's no question that the fatality rate has gone up. If we take it, we're looking at the road as a whole. Now let's look at it a little closer to your business. Many of you have work comp exposures. You have people working for you. The number one cause of fatalities in the workplace is vehicle involvement. 40% of workplace fatalities involve a vehicle. They're not all necessarily crashes, but it could be someone was hit by a vehicle, someone fell off a trailer, a truck, something like that. They were working on a vehicle, but that number is also up. This for decades was around 30%. In the past couple of years, it has jumped up. Well, 3 to 4 years, it has jumped up to 40%. And the other tough part of that is motor vehicle related work comp injuries are on average about 3 times more costly than any other workplace class of injury. It is in fact the leading overall. When you look at the volume of it, it's the most severe injury class in the work comp world. And so what does that mean? If we can just kind of put these numbers into this, folks, the National Safety Council in 2019 came up with, and they come up with it every couple of years, the value of a fatal injury, non-fatal, and you can see these things on the screen. A fatal injury right now is on average worth about $1.5 million in terms of the cost or the impact of that fatality. A non-fatal disabling injury, the claims payout are just over $80,000. The average, it is about $80,700. And even a property damage only, or there's nobody hurt, it's just physical damage type stuff, runs just over $9,300. The days of the old chrome bumper getting bumped and you could replace it for a few $100, they're gone. A lot of this is driven sometimes by the type of behavior going on, but it's also the value of the vehicles involved. So many sensors and electronics, which are very beneficial, but they also bring with them a cost to repair and replace. So you guys are, I call you an institution type organization. But the same is for anything, whether you're a commercial business or an institution. There's certain things that auto exposure can bring you. The obvious is you own vehicles and they're used in your business. There's definitely an exposure to an auto claim or auto loss with that. Most of us understand that, I think. And then you have institution-owned vehicles, but say you let certain folks in your institution take those home with them. So they're driving that potentially on a personal basis. If they're involved in any situation, then there's still an exposure to you folks in your risk management program. Then the other one that gets a little grayer is employee-owned vehicles. Using an employee who uses their own vehicle for your business or your commerce, if you will, that can come back to you. Typically, there's some isolation or insulation where their insurance would be primary. However, many people's personal policies don't come anywhere near what your commercial limits are. So they may have, in Ohio, I know you're legal by the insurance regs to have $25,000 of liability insurance. That's pretty low. That might get you to a hospital and a well-equipped Class 1 ambulance. It certainly will be difficult to cover the cost of any life flight involvement in any event you might have. So you're there, but you will typically step in over top of their limits. So what are some other, look at some other situations, one being rented vehicles. Sometimes you folks, your employees might rent a vehicle for your needs at your bequest. That can readily become an exposure to your risk program. Institution members using their own vehicles on behalf of your organization. Now, we talked about folks taking your company-owned or your organization-owned vehicle home with them, but then the other side of that is do you allow or expect people that work for you or even volunteers use their own vehicles on your behalf? That can come back to your risk program. And then the other big one is probably not as big as in your world, is the subcontracted or hired vehicles and operators. You may hire a charter bus. You might, I'm trying to think, you might have somebody that comes in and hauls material for you, and you request it. You buy material for your facility and you hire the trucker to bring it to you. These are things to think about. It's definitely more remote, but there's still a potential, again, typically based on the amount of damages involved in the event, that you could be brought into that. Um, so kind of just when you're thinking about this, think about it's not just your vehicles. That's the most important thing to remember. Remember, may have church members who are transporting half a dozen children to a camp in their own vehicle. And if there's any kind of mayhem at that point, it can get back to you, especially if maybe they had 10 kids in their vehicle and the vehicle was only designed for 8 or 7. So it's things to think about that can come back. And how do they come back to you? They come back to you through 3 key theories of liability, tort liability. And these 3, I'll give you the legal names for them, and then we'll talk about them in real words. Negligent hiring, negligent entrustment, and respondeat superior. Respondeat superior is really the easiest one to understand, and it's Latin for basically let the master answer. So any employer who has employees or people acting on their behalf can be held liable for the action of those employees. Pretty straightforward. Say you've got somebody taken off from your organization to a seminar, or in fact even closer than that, they're in town, they're going to go to a meeting across town, and they drive and they run a red light and severely injure somebody. That's going to come back to you because that employee was operating on your behalf. They were at your direction, if you will, and they caused mayhem. So look at it this way: you have somebody that runs in a band camp, and Rita's been a director there for over 10 years. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. Let's take the respondeat superior is pretty simple. It's you own the business, you're directing folks to do stuff, you're accountable for their behavior. Whereas negligent entrustment is the concept of you put somebody in a vehicle in that situation, and you might have known or should have known that that person was inexperienced, possibly reckless in their behavior, and you did not prevent them from operating on your behalf. And that gets a little gray. So, and I'll give you an example. You've got a supervisor that's gonna take. I'm sorry. She's gonna run out and she's going to a meeting like the one I mentioned earlier. However, she's driving a company car. She causes mayhem, and this actually is a real case I was involved with. There were severe injuries to a 4-month-old child. The claimants are asking for $3.5 million. This is about 10 years ago. In the discovery process, and if you're not familiar with discovery, basically both sides of the situation have the right to certain records that you maintain. It's called discovery. They can look at the black box on your vehicle. They can look at your hiring, your training records, all those kinds of things. But what happened in this case is this driver, when the discovery process came out, it was found that she had 5 events on her license, on her MVR. If you drove an MVR, or if you get an MVR and somebody generally gives you 3 to 5 years of their driving history from a legal standpoint. Well, in her situation, she had been working for this company for 10 years, over 10 years, And all these citations on her license, and one was a serious one was a reckless op. Uh, they all occurred in the last 5 years, most of them in the last 3 years. So how would that be negligent entrustment? Well, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. The company had a duty to vet that driver and manage that driver. One commonly accepted way to do that is to check their motor vehicle records or their driving history with the state they reside in. Well, all those citations were in there, and they occurred while she was working for this company. It became quite evident that this company was making no efforts to validate or verify her driver history. That's where it comes in, where I said in the beginning they should have known. Well, the argument was you should have been running MVRs on this driver every month or every year. And you should have picked this up. And had you done that, this event may have been avoided because she might not have been driving due to her record. The third one, negligent hiring, is very similar to entrustment. And there are very specific rules that have to be triggered to make an entrustment work. But negligent hiring is basically the same one. When you bring somebody in for the first time and allow them to operate or ask them to operate your vehicles, there's a duty to manage that. And such thing as you need to run their MVRs. You need to verify that they have a valid license. Asking for a copy of their license it could be an expired license, or it could be no good. It could have been taken away from them. So there's certain things you have to do, including employment, past employment, inquiries. These things are harder and harder to get, but there's an obligation that you can demonstrate. And this is where the defense posturing comes in. You need to be able to say, we did what was reasonable and prudent. It's not going to stop everything, but it can demonstrate that you've been doing the appropriate management when you have vehicles. Okay. And really what this does, it won't prevent the claim. And the way I put this out to folks is it will keep a $1,000 event at $1,000 instead of becoming $100,000 loss, because they had the ability to push negligence on your behavior, on your management. Hopefully that makes sense. When I first started in this world, 80% of my job was what I call physical risk management. I used to go out, look at vehicles, look at the files, and everything's good. 20% was a little bit of the management, the training. This concept has really flipped over the last few decades. We have very, very well-built, sustainable vehicles. We have incredible safety devices. What we now don't have necessarily is this understanding or concern to have structured management controls. And that's what we're going to talk about as we move forward here. I know I mentioned earlier that we're talking about all vehicles, but the focus on this is really your passenger transport. And I call it people movers. People who have companies who have people in the vehicle have a much greater exposure and therefore duty to manage to prevent those people from getting hurt. It's not like hauling nuts and bolts in a bucket. So what is passenger transportation and what's the concern? Typically, anything that is capable of hauling 7 or more people is considered a high capacity exposure. 7 people, 15 people, that's the typical range of a van, sometimes an SUV, that does not require a CDL to use. And that's where we focus. If you're over 15 passengers, and that includes a driver, that vehicle must be operated by a CDL driver when it's used in any kind of business, institutional, a manufacturer, anything. If that vehicle is being used in that style, it requires the driver to hold a current CDL, commercial driver's license. So that's the one thing with passenger transport or like people movers. The other thing is boarding and alighting. What's unusual to people moving is that automobile policy coverage extends not only to just crashes, but actually for folks getting on and off the vehicle. That can be a auto policy loss. So it's basically ground to seat, seat to ground, we call it. So your management has to recognize that and has to really address uh, how people are boarding and how people are leaving the bus. And where's that a concern? Typically, it's with a concern with younger or very elderly folks or people who have disabilities that makes it kind of difficult to climb into or out of a van. And take that one step further, wheelchair lifts, scooter lifts. These things are typically found in this type of environment, and they have to be pretty well controlled. And then the last one is you put a bucket of nuts and bolts in a truck, it stays there. Typically, if it's not gonna, you have to put load securement straps around it. Well, people are the same way. You have people that get in there. We have laws that say that they have to wear seatbelts and the equipment. If you bring somebody in with a wheelchair or a scooter, you have to be prepared to secure that equipment so it does not move in any kind of unanticipated event or causes damage or injury to somebody else. And there's standard tie downs for wheelchairs, and we'll touch on that a little bit. So those are some of the key things that really differentiate people mover from a property mover. If you can walk away with one thing, they're five things, frankly. When you do people moving, when you do passenger management, it is most critical that you do the following things. You understand and follow the procedures for safe loading, unloading, and transporting people. That's a big one. That's your duty. You're offering that service, that's your duty. If you have chair lifts, wheelchair lifts, you must be able to demonstrate you're maintaining them, you're inspecting them on a regular basis. Any kind of wheelchair securement or access, you have to have a 4-point system for securing the chair and the passenger. Any handholds, floor mats, seat belts, any of those devices you have in your vehicles, you have to ensure that they're being maintained. And that's done through a pretty consistent inspection program. And seatbelt use is mandatory. If anybody is going to ride with you, and it's a tough one because often your drivers are personal friends of the people involved. They really have to stick their guns and say you need to wear your seatbelt when you ride with us. Those are the real important things to walk away with out of this session. How do we do some of that? Pre-trip inspections are so vital, and hopefully they're documented. They don't have to be extensive. They don't have to be 10 pages long, but your drivers need to understand how to do them, why they're doing them, and what they're looking for. The key things: horns, lights, turn signals, backup alarms, any of that stuff. Your window wipers are working. There's appropriate fluid in there. Windows are clean. Lights, mirrors, any kind of sensors are clean. Brakes and steering work appropriately. Any dash gauges show everything's good. There's no warnings up. And one very, very critical specific item is tire tread and pressure with these vans. In the older days, and we're going to talk a little bit about what is a good van. In previous days, when the whole situation came up in the early or mid 80s with the vans flipping the 15-passenger vans, much of the data showed these were really due to tire pressure issues. And the tire's low, the tire blows, the driver tries to react to that tripping event, and that triggers the whole rollover event. Pressure is huge, appropriate pressure. Today's vans come with pressure indicators, so it's much better. But your drivers have to, one, know what the proper pressure is, know how to check it if they don't have indicators on their dash, and then they have to understand, or you have to provide guidance as to how do they add air to it. It's surprisingly a lot of people don't know, or they don't have a facility to go to. You may not have an air compressor at your facility, but we've got to make sure that the drivers have access to that. And then obviously check underneath. Before a driver leaves, they should check underneath for any leaks, any kind of indications of issues. And there will be another session on the platform that you will be able. It's going to be very similar in the beginning to this, but it will be geared towards drivers for them to look at specifically to understand their duties as a driver. One of the things that I often come across when I'm dealing with organizations like this is they have some older vans and they have the old 15 passenger. I don't know if any of you know why those came about. In 1983, the CDL law came in, and one of the components of that law was that any vehicle that holds 16 people or more must be driven by a CDL driver. Well, this law was being promulgated in the late 70s, early 80s. Ford, Chevy, they all realized, hey, we have these commercial vans out there that we can modify slightly. We can put seats in them instead of them just a flat bed to load cargo in. We can put seats in them, and we can put, guess how many seats? 15 seats. So we can market schools, churches, institutions, even businesses, shuttle businesses. They don't have to hire a driver with a CDL. Anybody can drive it, and they slapped seats in there, and they market them quite successfully. The problem was that, as you all, I would believe you're all aware of, there were some very serious stability issues. So I do get asked a lot of times, well, what can we do to make our vans safer? There are things, there are aftermarket stability systems. I've seen actually people put a dually axle on the back. You can do these things, but here's the bottom line. It's very important to remember that a large van is more challenging to drive, especially when you have people that aren't familiar with that type of vehicle. People typically rely on side view mirrors. They become pretty difficult in a large van if they're not properly instructed how to set them and use them. Changing lanes becomes an issue. Here's my dilemma when people do this is you're going to improve the stability potentially a little bit by adding some sway bars, adding some torsion to the springs. However, you're still operating a vehicle that maybe was built 15 years ago, maybe it was built 20 years ago. A lot has happened in vehicle safety since then. So you might enhance the stability a bit, but you're also giving up ABS brakes, active braking systems, electronic stability control, active cruise systems, mirrors that identify people in your blind spots, backup cameras, all kinds of things, better safety or better seatbelt systems, airbags, all those things are in these newer vehicles. So I'm not sure that I would say improving a little bit of stability is really worthwhile when you look at what you're not getting in your newer vehicles. Doesn't have to be brand new. A lot of stuff is in older vehicles. But I want you to really think about that. The older vans, any van built after 2006, or I'm sorry, 2011 is really, it's been modified at the OEM, at the original manufacturers. The wheelbases are longer, wider. The center of gravity is lower. They aren't as concerning as those old 15-passenger vans were. But any high-capacity van, no matter what it is or how new it is, brings with it that other exposure of, I don't just have a driver in it, I can have 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 people in that van. And if something goes wrong, it's going to exacerbate the entire situation. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to move on that, but we can also discuss that as we go through the program. So this leads me to what is a good way for an organization to demonstrate their functional management? And there's 4 key tenets of transportation safety. I want you to think about these, and it doesn't necessarily mean written or big books. It means you understand why you're doing this, and the folks that are operating your vehicles and using your vehicles understand why you're doing this. So the first one is a commitment to safety. And we'll touch on these a little bit. Comprehensive fleet safety program. Again, not necessarily written, but maybe components of it are documented to verify. You want to invest in your drivers and employees, and in your case, even volunteers. And like everything, there has to be a continuous improvement. If you take these four things and compare them to building a house or the structure of a house, look at it this way. When you're building a structure, there's four areas of concern. The foundation's got to be good, or the rest of the building won't be too strong. Then you got to build out the structure. Then you bring in the mechanicals, the power, the HVAC, the plumbing, and then there's the maintenance and upkeep. And these will align quite well with these concepts as we go forward. So when I talk about a commitment to safety, that first tenet, that really is your ability to demonstrate you're organized for fleet safety. What does that mean? That means essentially in your world, if a driver has a problem, can they go to somebody and be confident that it will be addressed? Now, if you're a small organization, that's pretty simple. If you get larger, you have different locations, different divisions, possibly, whatnot. You want to be able to demonstrate and be confident that everybody in the organization appreciates who's in charge and how to express concerns in the course of doing their job. Okay, there should be defined responsibility. If Joe's a manager of your camp, Joe needs to be provided with what his responsibilities are as regards the auto and many other things, but as regards the auto. Whoever's operating that vehicle needs to understand. Anybody that's approved to drive needs to understand what your expectations are of them. That could be simply rules of the road in a smaller organization, which, those are pretty straightforward. Structured accountability. You give them the responsibility, then there has to be a form of accountability. If they fail to manage that responsibility, what is the accountability? If you tell a driver, you've got to keep a driving record with no more than 3 violations in 3 years, what happens if they exceed that? That needs to be defined. And then a culture of risk management. You embrace, we call it a culture, you embrace the risk management. You take time to understand what the exposures are, and you take time to develop a functional program to manage that. That's the foundation of things. Then you go to the structure, and this is probably the most important and where you're going to spend most of your time, is just a comprehensive fleet safety program. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are defined policies and procedures for vehicle operation. They're out there. Somebody knows them. They don't, again, it's always better to have it documented, but the other way they do discovery is through depositions. And if you're confident that your driver or any employee that could be deposed in a situation will answer the way you expect them to. Yeah, we do have this, we do have that. That's okay. Formal rules addressing safety and use. There has to be some evidence of trip management, like a dispatcher, just trip management. If somebody wants to use a van to go to a camp, to go on a field trip, whatever it may be, they can't just get in that van and go. There has to be steps to follow to get access to that van, so we know who's in it, where they're going, the appropriate plans are in place. Cargo and passenger management. This is one of the big areas where in institutional worlds where we get into trouble. I have dealt with many situations where there's a van going to a river to go canoeing. There'll be 8 people in that van, 9 people in that van, and it may be 2 hours away. It's a whole day event. Well, they connect the trailer to the van to carry 5 canoes. And that's a tough thing. When you're moving people, to put a trailer on it is really an issue. just as it is to put uh, cargo, suitcases, any kind of stuff on the roof of that van. We're already dealing with a vehicle, and even today's, they're not as stable as a passenger car, as a sedan. So when you add a trailer, when you put stuff on the roof, that kind of stuff is going to decrease the stability of the vehicle. So we want to avoid that. We don't. A lot of entities I've worked with take out the back seat of a 15 passenger van. Well, now it's a 12 passenger. But then instead, they load up all kinds of cargo in that area, which basically makes that van unstable again. So be aware of some of those issues. Accident reporting and investigation. When a driver gets in a situation, do they know what to do? And that can be simply accomplished by putting in a report of accident pamphlet in each vehicle, making sure the drivers understand. Those things typically have procedures on what to follow or what to do in an accident. Equipment inspection and maintenance. Again, today's equipment, today's vehicles are very, very mechanically sound. And the days of vehicle maintenance issues or things not working or breaking and causing an accident are pretty much in the past, but they still happen. And when they do happen, it's indefensible. When you have, most vehicles have indicator lights, warning lights, all this stuff. If something fails that should have been maintained, or there was an awareness that it needed help or needed work, and you didn't, then maintenance issues causing an accident are very difficult to defend. And then vehicle selection. You as an organization really need to understand, what are we going to use this vehicle for, and what's the appropriate vehicle for our needs. And there's all kinds of information and help out there for that. But those are the key parts of it. The next tenet, and this is a high level overview, and I'm sure we can individually, there'll be some additional handouts and things available from the insurance board platform for you to help you understand this. So tenet 3, this is the operator investment. This is the driver. And this is where we see most failure when it comes to negligence. So how do you make sure it works? You have to have a defined driver selection process. And we'll touch on those things. You have to have some structured training and safety awareness. I call it safety awareness much more than driver training. All of us grew up in this country. Anymore, it's unusual to hear of someone that's over the age of 18, 20 that does not have a license. We all get a license when we're 16, 17 years old. But in the vast majority of drivers, that's the extent of our training. That's the extent of our awareness. We don't go to training in this country unless you get a CDL, unless you're working for a company driving in a commercial capacity, or you get in trouble in the courts. You played bad on the road, so the court may say you gotta take some schooling. But generally, we don't do a lot of training, so that we need to keep our drivers' awareness up. And one of the simplest ways I talk about that is, I work for a company. Let's say I live next door. For the company, I drive a blue Ford Fusion. I own a red Ford Fusion. I parked a red Ford Fusion in my driveway. I use the blue one when I'm at work. I get to work, my boss says, Mike, Highway, I need you to go to 7-Eleven and get me a slushie. I want one of those slushies. It's a mile up the road. I get in that blue company car and I run up there and I come back and I give my boss a slushie. Then at the end of the day, I go home to my real boss, and my lovely bride says, Mike, I need a slushie. I get in my red Fusion and I run up to the same store and I come back and I give my real boss her slushie. Now, those trips on the surface sound identical. There's no big difference, but there's a huge difference from a liability standpoint. One, I'm in the course and scope of my employment and therefore commerce. The other is a personal trip. It's viewed entirely different in the courts of our society. When somebody gets hurt on the roads in our country, right or wrong, we have decided they're going to be taken care of as best as possible. So when a branded vehicle, and by that I mean any kind of vehicle associated with any kind of organization, is involved in that accident, it's likely that you're going to have, or that organization is going to have, far more insurance available than a personal. So there's going to be a greater effort to go at that. And that's really the difference. Everything's the same, but drivers need to understand one of the most difficult things is to get them to understand that this may smell, sound, taste like everything they do at home, and it may be their own vehicle, but once they're doing it for a company, it's a different game. They have to have their game on and be ready to go. And then in the cases where you have paid employees, you have to motivate them, you have to appropriately compensate them. And also in the mix is keeping their health and wellness aware of it, and keeping, depending on how large you get, you may want to institute health medical benefits, gymnasium concepts or contracts where your employees can go there. Just, you have to be careful with elderly drivers. I have sugar. At some point, sugar may be a problem for me to actually drive a commercial vehicle, but we have to be aware of some of those things as we hire and work with our drivers. We talked a little bit about selection under this. This is a key area. You as an organization need to define minimum age requirements and minimum experience requirements of your operators. Now, age can be an issue because unless you're a federally DOT registered vehicle, they all have to be 21 years old if they're crossing state lines. Non-regulated vehicles, we have to be concerned with age discrimination on both ends of it. So instead of saying everybody's got to be at least 25 years old, we say everybody's got to be has to have at least 5 years driving experience. And that'll bring your age up. These vehicles are more difficult to operate, and I'm not comfortable when I have a young driver, which again, I've seen many times in camp environments, those kind of things where you have camp counselors that are 17, 18, 19 years old driving these things. And that's concerning because they just don't have that experience necessarily on how to react to the unintended events that happen. Established driving record criteria. How many violations would you be willing to accept on a candidate's driver's license? One of the primary steps are, and typically what's accepted is a driver with no more than 3 moving violations. Parking violations, non-moving violations aren't necessarily an issue, and no majors. And what are majors? The majors are the alcohol, drug involved, felonies, hit and runs, reckless with injury or damage, those kind of things. Those are the type of things that you have to be comfortable with. With the understanding, if I put a person like that behind the wheel of my vehicle, is that going to cause negligence? Is somebody going to look at me and say, was that really the best driver to put in charge of X number of passengers on this trip? Again, there's pamphlets we have available that describe how to review and evaluate drivers' MVRs. Training and awareness, there's 3 categories. The most vital one is the initial. If someone's coming on board, be it a volunteer, a church member, an employee, you need to define what your expectations are of that person doing that driving. They need to understand that from the get-go. Remedial says you got a driver who has maybe a speeding issue. They've had 2 or 3 speeding tickets. You want to focus training, focus awareness on the impact of speeding in that case. And focus is the best way for me is you see a trend in your overall fleet. So here's the best way. I've used this as an explanation. I am Highway Harold, and I get behind the wheel, and I have this unbelievable need to run over Canadian geese. I just all my life. I can't help it. I got to hit Canadian geese. I get this job. I'm doing everything well, but my boss says, Mike, you got to lay off the Canadian geese. You can't do this. So they say to me, we're gonna put you through some focus training on avoiding geese. Okay, fair enough. Lo and behold, I go through this training and I'm cured of my need to run over Canadian geese. However, I've been driving there for a year and a half. Well, I've changed my ways. I've also been talking to all the other drivers, and now they all enjoy it. At the end of the year, when we look at the losses for my company, we've got 20% of our losses are being due to hitting Canadian geese. We've now taken one driver's individual behavior and it's stretched out across our driver pool. And believe it or not, this happens a lot. I was in one case once where this driver of the dump truck, and he bragged about if you went 48 miles an hour on this, it was a city grid street, you could hit every green light. The speed limit was 30. But he talked to all these other drivers, and he was always talking about, I can get through here. I don't have to shift everything all the time. He had everybody in this company, not everybody, but a significant number of all racing down this road. So at the end of that year, they took all their training budget, if you will, and focused it on speeding and that type of behavior. So that was focused. So those are three. And focus requires you know what's happening in your fleet, you know what's happening by your individual drivers, all those things. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And then the last one, the maintenance, the continuous maintenance of your structure, if you will. You have to be aware of your losses, trending, what's going on with your organization. In many cases, it may be very simple for you. You're in one locale, you have 2 or 3 vehicles, but often you might have a school, a nursery, a daycare, different things going on where you may not be aware of everything that's going on. So you need to definitely make an effort to look at your losses, identify any trends, and try and address them as soon as you can. Set performance goals and metrics. For instance, if in my world, we use a 5% rule. If I have 100 vehicles in a fleet, I should not see an average performance will be 5% of those are involved in claims. So we get 5 claims out of a 100 vehicle fleet that are preventable, that are clearly, it wasn't, it was your driver's fault. They weren't struck by somebody else. There wasn't anything else involved. The driver was culpable for it. So there's a 5%. 10% is kind of like, well, over 10, there's something going on with this account. That's a benchmark. You can set goals for your individual drivers. If you use telematics or anything like that, telematics brings in another whole tool to set goals. We can touch on telematics at the end here. Make sure that you have trip management. I worked with a university at college once, and one of their vans flipped, and there were 11 people in it. And when they became aware of it, and this all happens in minutes sometimes, the management of the university had no clue who was in that van. They had no record. And I had been working with them to start setting up a trip management. Somebody knows who the passengers are. They didn't know, and they were asked some pretty tough questions, and they couldn't answer those right then. That certainly had an impact on that overall loss. So you really need to make sure you control the keys. Nobody gets in that van without you. And by you, I mean your system of management. I should not be able to just walk in there and get a van or get a car even without going through some sort of qualifying process. Hopefully that makes sense, and that's big. And sadly, that's where we see a lot of events. It's that one-off or something that happened, and no one was aware that there was a need for it. So it's something close, something important to keep close to. The other thing, the program review. Uh, Things change. Things change in your operation. Things change in the law. Things change in the environment around you, where your folks are. You need to review it and make sure that the equipment and procedures are still current. And then fleet age and maintenance. Just understand that the older your vehicle gets, the further separated it is from the current state of safety technology that's available. And sometimes keeping an older vehicle is not necessarily the best decision. If it is done, you have to adjust your maintenance on that vehicle and make sure it is in tip-top shape. We look at some things that are, again, I've touched on a few things, but I want to really focus on making sure when you promote safe vehicle operation, you include some vehicle use guidelines. I call them highways rules of road. Just some notes. Don't pick up hitchhikers. Don't do this. Go the speed limit. No cell phone use. Cell phone use is huge. There should be some attempt at you folks at the management to address what is acceptable use. From my world, from best practice standpoint, no cell phone use while you're behind the wheel. States do allow handheld or hands-free type use. But again, that's your call. The best practice would be no cell phone use by the driver. And in many cases with these vans, you have multiple people. Assign the cell phone and communication to the person next to the driver versus letting the driver deal with it. Motor vehicle records should be checked at least once a year. Background checks, again, if you're involved with children, adults that need assistance, background checks are critical. Alcohol testing, drug tests, pretty important. And driver training and awareness. Recognizing safe drivers is a very good tool to demonstrate your culture and where your organization is in the overall fleet management program. There's so many ways to do it. It can be as simple as I work with a company and we established a refrigerator, the Home Hero, and they would send home coupon books to a Dairy Queen or a McDonald's for a driver that did something good, and a nice little card, maybe with a magnet. They can attach it to the refrigerator. And when that driver gets home, he's a hero at home because of something he did a job, versus handing that driver a new company cap or jacket and say, thank you very much. Sometimes the other drivers will pick on him, but when he gets home, he's a hero of his family. And that's very inexpensive, but very, very strong message sent there. Regular safety inspections of your equipment, definable maintenance records. In many of your small organizations, the maintenance records are your receipts from a garage. That's okay. And then telematics. I don't know how many of you are involved or using telematics, and basically the tracking of vehicles by electronic systems. These are great. They're still at the stage where you won't necessarily be gigged for not using them in a mediation situation, but they're cropping up more and more for a couple of reasons. The telematics give you basically in the seat access to how that driver's behaving in terms of hard braking, acceleration, pitch sway. Sometimes there's cameras involved. These things are flags, maybe that you have a driver that needs some help. They identify it. GPS is associated with them, locating vehicles, knowing where vehicles are, especially when they're full of passengers that are in your care, custody, and control, is critical. I often hear, well, it can incriminate my driver too. And the reality is yes. But if you properly train, properly vet or qualify your drivers, give them the appropriate guidance, your driver is going to be a better performer than anybody else out there on the road. The vast majority of time is what I'm saying is the vast majority of time is these systems vindicate commercial or professional drivers, if you will. The times that maybe your driver did something wrong, from a claim management standpoint, it's much better to understand that concern at the beginning of that claim rather than going into a claim on maybe some misconceptions of the situation, and 6 months into that claim defense it comes to light that he was on it or the driver was on their cell phone or there are some other issues. um, that claim might be handled a different way from the get-go if we know there's culpability. But realistically, the vast majority of that data will defend your drivers um, in commercial vehicles. And keep in mind that today's safety technology, we call it active safety. These are the adaptive cruise, the collision avoidance, blind spot warnings, rear proximity sensors and cameras. These are invaluable tools. But the one thing that happens is drivers typically have a hard time accepting new. And one of the things we find is that if you adequately train or make your drivers aware of the technology, what it's for and how to use it, they will embrace it. But the ABS brakes were one of the greatest manufacturing decisions or situations. ABS brakes, when they first came out, the manufacturers failed to clearly have people understand what they do. And everybody got on, oh, I can stop faster. You really don't stop faster. You stop in a very controlled manner. And what the benefit of them is that you can steer your vehicle while you're skidding. So drivers would get them, and especially us older groups, we'd get them and we'd hit the brake, and the first thing ABS does sort of kind of bounce back at you. Well, that meant to me in my 1961 Comet that my brake line just blew or my master cylinder blew. So you instinctively take your foot off. So many people were doing that. Second, they get, oh yeah, these work, and they slam the brakes and they're going through it, and they go straight into the car and they hit it in front of them because they didn't skid. The ABS brakes don't stop you sooner, but they give you the ability to steer. So instead of steering, they just ran right into the car in front of them. They could have turned, and you will never accept that until you actually go into an open parking lot where there's a little bit of snow and you have a driver try that. Then they go, wow, that's why these things work so well. Well, that's about wraps this up. I hope you got something out of it. Again, there will be materials available that you can access from the Insurance Board platform to help supplement this. Thank you very much.